In 480 BC, Xerxes I of Persia set out to finish what his father Darius had started, conquering Greece. Xerxes pulled together one of the largest armies the ancient world had ever seen, with men from across his vast empire and a fleet big enough to dominate the seas. To the Persians, this war was about pride, revenge, and proving that no small cluster of city-states could stand against imperial power. But this was exactly where Xerxes overreached. The sheer size of his force created problems that even the mighty Persian Empire couldn't solve. Feeding and supplying hundreds of thousands of men in hostile territory turned into a nightmare. Rivers ran dry as his army marched, and supply lines stretched too far to stay reliable. Greek defenders fighting for their homes didn't need numbers. They needed terrain and strategy. At Thermopylae, Leonidas and his Spartans showed that a small, determined force could slow the Persian juggernaut. At sea, Xerxes miscalculated again. His ships were strong in open waters, but in the narrow straits of the Salamis, they became a tangled mess and easy prey for the faster and more maneuverable Greek triremes. What Xerxes thought would be a quick victory instead exposed the limits of sheer power. His gamble drained Persian resources, damaged his authority, and gave Greeks confidence that would shape the wars to come. Pericles is often celebrated as the great statesman of Athens, the man who oversaw the Parthenon and helped turn the city into the center of culture and democracy. But his biggest political decision, leading Athens into the Peloponnesian War against Sparta in 431 BC, was also the one that undid much of what he had built. At the time, Athens and Sparta were locked in a Cold War of sorts, with rival alliances and constant tension. When fighting finally broke out, Pericles refused to meet Sparta on open ground. He knew Athens couldn't win a head-on battle against Sparta's seasoned hoplites. Instead, he told Athenians to retreat behind the long walls and rely on their navy to keep supplies coming in. The idea seemed clever. Athens would outlast Sparta by sea power while avoiding destruction on land. But in reality, it didn't go so smoothly. The countryside was left to burn, angering rural citizens. Then disaster struck. A plague tore through Athens, taking out tens of thousands, including Pericles himself. Morale collapsed and leadership fractured, and his carefully balanced strategy fell apart. The war dragged on for nearly 3 decades. What was supposed to be a defensive strategy turned into a grinding cycle of failed expeditions and political instability. In the end, Sparta, with help from Persia, broke Athens' naval dominance and forced its surrender. Marcus Licinius Crassus had wealth that most Romans could barely imagine. He was the richest man in the Republic, but money wasn't enough. Crassus wanted what his rivals, Pompey and Caesar, had: military glory. That hunger for recognition drove him to make one of the worst military decisions in Roman history: the invasion of Parthia in 53 BC. Crassus marched east, convinced that his legions would crush the Parthians just as Rome had crushed so many others. But Parthia wasn't like the enemies Rome was used to. Their cavalry dominated the open desert, with horse archers who could harass from a distance, and heavy cataracts that smashed through Roman lines. At Carrhae, the Parthians put these skills to devastating use. They staged false retreats to lure the Romans into traps, then surround them with endless waves of arrows. Roman shields couldn't hold forever, and the legions crumbled under the constant barrage. Crassus himself perished during the chaotic negotiations, and his army was wiped out or captured. It was one of the greatest humiliations Rome had ever faced. By the time of the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony weren't just fighting for territory, they were fighting for survival. Their partnership was both political and personal, blending romance with a shared vision of ruling the Eastern Mediterranean. To Antony, aligning with Cleopatra meant wealth, ships, and soldiers. To Cleopatra, Antony was her ticket to keeping Egypt independent in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. Together, they looked like a power strong enough to challenge Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted heir. But their ambitions ran into cold reality. Off the coast of western Greece, Antony and Cleopatra gathered a massive fleet that seemed to outnumber Octavian. But the problem was their ships were heavy and sluggish compared to the lighter, faster vessels commanded by Octavian's admiral Agrippa. Once the battle began, Agrippa's tactics tore through Antony's lines. Then came the moment that sealed their fate. Cleopatra suddenly broke away with her personal squadron. Antony, torn between duty and loyalty to her, followed. Their departure left the rest of the fleet in chaos, demoralized and leaderless. The loss of Actium shattered their cause. Within a year, both Antony and Cleopatra were dead by their own hands, and Octavian stood unchallenged. By the dawn of the 18th century, Louis XIV was already known as the Sun King, the most powerful monarch in Europe. But in 1701, the passing of Charles II of Spain dangled a prize too tempting to resist: control of the Spanish throne. Louis moved quickly to secure it for his grandson, Philip, believing it would cement Bourbon dominance across Europe. It seemed like a masterstroke. France and Spain united under one dynasty that would reshape the balance of power. But that's exactly what terrified the rest of Europe. England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire weren't about to let Louis tilt the board so far in his favor. They formed the Grand Alliance, and what followed became a continent-wide struggle, with fighting stretching from Flanders to Italy to the New World. French generals like Villars fought brilliantly, but France's resources were stretched thin. The war dragged on for over a decade. In the end, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 secured Philip as King of Spain, but it came with strings attached. Spain and France could never merge into one empire. Louis had won a throne for his grandson, but at an enormous cost. Charles XII of Sweden wasn't like other kings. Crowned at just 15 years old in 1697, many European leaders thought they could take advantage of his youth. Within 3 years, Denmark, Saxony-Poland, and Russia banded together, confident they could crush Sweden's dominance in the Baltic. They were wrong. Charles stunned Europe with bold strikes. He forced Denmark out of the war and humiliated a much larger Russian army at Narva in 1700. After years of fighting across Poland, he turned his sights on Russia, launching an invasion in 1708, aiming to break Peter the Great's rising power once and for all. It was a gamble that ignored one key lesson. Russia's size, weather, and endurance were unlike anything Sweden had faced before. As Charles marched deeper into Russian territory, supply lines collapsed, soldiers starved, frostbite ravaged the army, and morale crumbled. At Poltava in 1709, the myth of Swedish invincibility shattered as Peter's reorganized forces crushed Charles' exhausted troops. Exiled in the Ottoman Empire, Charles watched as Sweden's status as great power unraveled. His relentless pursuit of glory had pushed his kingdom beyond its limits, proving that courage and boldness mean little when strategy fails to respect reality. Napoleon Bonaparte was at the height of his power in 1812. He had already reshaped Europe through war and diplomacy, and now he set his sights on Russia. His reasoning seemed simple. Russia had defied the continental system, an economic blockade designed to strangle Britain. If Napoleon could force Tsar Alexander I back into line, his dominance over Europe would be complete. To achieve this, Napoleon built a Grande Armée, a force of more than 600,000 men drawn from across his empire. It was the largest army Europe had ever seen. He believed his usual formula of speed and brilliant tactics would deliver another swift victory. But Russia refused to play by his rules. Instead of standing and fighting, the Russians retreated further into their vast lands, burning crops, villages, and supplies as they went. Every mile Napoleon gained left his men hungrier, weaker, and more exposed. One major clash came at Borodino, a brutal battle that left tens of thousands lifeless on both sides, but produced no clear winner. Napoleon pushed on and reached Moscow, only to find a city deliberately emptied and set ablaze. With no food, no shelter, and winter closing in, the French had no choice but to retreat. What followed was a nightmare. Freezing temperatures, starvation, and constant attacks from Russian forces tore the once mighty Grande Armée apart. By the time the survivors staggered back to friendly territory, fewer than 100,000 remained. Napoleon's invasion of Russia became the ultimate lesson in military overreach. Even the greatest general of his era could not conquer geography, weather, and a patient enemy. Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America, entered history as the leader of one of the most ambitious but doomed challenges to the United States. A seasoned politician and West Point graduate, Davis believed that the South could secure independence after Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 pushed several states to secede. His job was monumental. He had to build a new government from scratch, raising the supply armies and convincing foreign powers like Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. Davis embraced an offensive-defensive strategy. The Confederacy would defend its territory, but strike when opportunities arose, hoping to wear down Northern willpower and force a political settlement. But Davis's downfall was his struggle to make it work. He clashed with state governors who resisted central authority and with generals whose egos and rivalries complicated military planning. Meanwhile, the Union had clear advantage in population and resources, which became more decisive as the war dragged on. Confederate armies did score dramatic early victories, like at Bull Run and Chancellorsville, which gave Davis hope that momentum could tip the balance. But as Union forces pushed deeper into Southern territory, the blockaded ports, shortages of weapons, food, and money crippled the Confederate war effort. Inflation soared, morale collapsed, and the foreign recognition Davis desperately sought never arrived. By 1865, Union armies under Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman broke Confederate resistance. Richmond fell. Robert E. Lee surrendered, and Davis himself was captured while attempting to escape. Kaiser Wilhelm II came to the German throne in 1888 with grand ambitions of turning his empire into a dominant global power. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in 1914, Wilhelm made the fateful choice to give Austria-Hungary a blank check of support. That unconditional promise encouraged Vienna to take a hard line against Serbia, setting off a chain reaction that spiraled into a world war. Once the fighting began, Wilhelm quickly lost influence over strategy. Real control shifted to his generals, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, while the Kaiser became more of a symbolic figure. At first, German armies won impressive victories, but the war soon bogged down in a brutal stalemate. Trench warfare, naval blockades, and the strain of fighting multiple enemies drained German resources. As the years dragged on, the empire's economy faltered and unrest spread at home. By 1918, with the Allies advancing and revolution brewing in Berlin, Wilhelm fled into exile in the Netherlands. Tsar Nicholas II entered the Russo-Japanese War believing his vast empire could easily overpower a rising Asian power. The conflict centered on Korea and Manchuria, key territories both nations saw as vital to their future influence. Nicholas expected a quick victory that would boost Russian prestige and strengthen his rule. But instead, the war revealed just how unprepared his empire was for modern conflict. The Japanese struck first, launching a surprise attack on Port Arthur in 1904. Russia's defenses were caught off guard, and the Tsar's commanders struggled to coordinate a response. Nicholas then gambled on sending the Baltic Fleet halfway around the world to break Japan's control of the seas. The result was the Battle of Tsushima, one of the most decisive naval defeats in history, with nearly the entire Russian fleet destroyed. For the empire, the humiliation was immense. Beyond the battlefield, the war had profound political consequences. The losses exposed corruption, poor planning, and outdated military systems. At home, the anger of workers and peasants erupted into strikes and protests, sparking the 1905 revolution. Nicholas was forced to make limited concessions. but his reputation as a capable ruler never recovered. When Benito Mussolini dragged Italy into World War II in 1940, he imagined himself leading the new Roman Empire. Germany's earlier victories in France and the Low Countries convinced him that the war would be short and that Italy could claim easy territorial rewards by joining in. Declaring war on France and Britain seemed like a bold move, but it quickly exposed how ill-prepared Italy really was. The Italian army was poorly equipped, poorly trained, and stretched thin. Their advance into southern France achieved little, and their campaigns in North Africa turned chaotic, as supply lines collapsed and morale sank. Mussolini then made another gamble by invading Greece in late 1940, only to meet fierce resistance from the Greeks, who pushed Italian forces back into Albania. Hitler was forced to step in and bail out his ally, which exposed Italy as more of a burden than a partner. By 1943, Allied troops invaded Sicily, and Italy itself became the battlefield. Mussolini was arrested and deposed by his own king, only to be rescued by German commandos and placed at the head of a German-controlled puppet state in northern Italy. By then, his dream of empire was finished. His reckless entry into the war not only weakened the Axis alliance, but also led to Italy's devastation and eventual surrender. In June 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, one of the largest invasions in history, sending more than 3 million German soldiers into the Soviet Union. Hitler believed that the Soviet state was weak and that the campaign would be over in a matter of months. The plan was to seize cities like Moscow, Leningrad, and Kyiv, while achieving his ideological goal of Lebensraum, or living space, for Germany. At first, the results seemed to justify his confidence. German armies swept across vast areas, encircling hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops and taking enormous stretches of land. But as the army pushed deeper, the realities of the Russian landscape and climate began to set in. Supply lines were stretched across hundreds of miles, equipment broke, and soldiers faced exhaustion. The Soviets, instead of collapsing, dug in and resisted fiercely. When winter hit, German troops lacked proper clothing, food, and shelter. The campaign turned into a disaster. The brutal fighting at Stalingrad in 1942-43 saw the German Sixth Army surrounded and forced to surrender, shattering the image of German invincibility. By overextending his forces and opening a two-front war, Hitler seized Germany's fate. On August 2, 1990, Saddam Hussein made a gamble that would shatter Iraq's regional standing. Facing crippling debt after the Iran-Iraq War, he turned to Kuwait, whose oil wealth seemed like a solution to Iraq's financial crisis. Saddam accused Kuwait of deliberately overproducing oil to drive prices down, weakening Iraq's economy, and even claimed that Kuwait was stealing oil from Iraqi fields through slant drilling. These grievances provided the justification for a swift invasion. Within 2 days, Iraqi forces occupied Kuwait, expecting little international resistance. But Saddam miscalculated. The United Nations condemned the action immediately, and the United States reorganized a massive coalition to expel Iraqi troops. Operation Desert Storm in early 1991 overwhelmed Iraq's military, using superior air power and precision strikes to cripple Saddam's forces and liberate Kuwait in just 6 weeks. The invasion left Iraq isolated, crushed by sanctions, and facing internal uprisings that Saddam put down brutally. What he thought would be a quick path to power and wealth turned into a disaster that weakened his regime and laid the groundwork for future wars. In March 2003, George W. Bush ordered U.S. forces into Iraq, launching one of the most controversial wars of modern times. The stated reason was clear. Saddam Hussein's regime was accused of hiding weapons of mass destruction, and after the trauma of 9/11, the Bush administration argued that America could not wait for threats to materialize. Intelligence agencies offered reports that seemed to support the claim, but evidence was thin and heavily disputed. The invasion itself was swift. Baghdad fell within weeks, and Saddam Hussein's government collapsed. But victory on paper quickly unraveled into chaos. No stockpiles of WMDs were ever found, and Iraq spiraled into sectarian violence, with insurgencies and civil war. The U.S. military found itself fighting not just to stabilize Iraq, but to survive years of guerrilla warfare that drained resources and morale. Billions of dollars drained into the conflict. Thousands of lives were lost, and U.S. credibility suffered on the world stage. Instead of reshaping the Middle East in America's image, the war destabilized the region and opened the door for extremist groups like ISIS to rise. On February 24, 2022, Vladimir Putin made the gamble that has come to define his rule. He ordered a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, presenting it as a mission to protect Russian speakers and stop NATO's influence from creeping closer to Russia's borders. Putin had long spoken of Russians and Ukrainians as one people, framing Ukraine's independence as a historical mistake he intended to correct. The plan was bold, but reckless. Russian forces were meant to sweep into Ukraine, capturing Kyiv within days, and replace the government with one loyal to Moscow. Instead, they ran into determined resistance. Ukrainian troops and civilians fought back with a mix of conventional defense and creative guerrilla tactics, making every advance costly. Western nations quickly poured in weapons, funding, and intelligence support, tilting the balance further. Russian soldiers faced broken supply lines, low morale, and commanders who underestimated the enemy. Entire offensives stalled or collapsed, forcing retreats from Kyiv and later Kharkiv. What was supposed to be a lightning war became a drawn-out grind, and the fallout went beyond the battlefield. Millions of Ukrainians are displaced, and Russian soldiers are losing their lives in huge numbers. Not to mention the sweeping sanctions that isolated Russia from global markets. Putin's decision meant to cement Russia's strength. Instead, it has weakened it, showing how a miscalculation can spiral into disaster with consequences felt worldwide. Most of these leaders seem to have severely miscalculated their ability to effectively wage a war, either through overconfidence, arrogance, or simple foolishness. What's your take? Which of these was the biggest mistake? And how does a society that's become even more global prevent this from happening again? I'd love to hear your take, so let us know what you think in the comments. And if you're still around, give the video a like and subscribe to the channel to get notified about more videos like this we come out with in the future. Thanks for watching. See you next time.